So today, we're going to dive into a pretty radical idea. The very way we organize our world, in all these neat, separate boxes, might actually be holding us back. We're going to look at a kind of mental map that's designed to break down those walls and just maybe change how we see everything.
And it all kicks off with something you probably see a dozen times a day. A box, a simple little field asking for your email or your phone number. We fill these things out without even thinking about it, right? They're basically the architecture of our digital lives, organizing information and defining who gets in and who stays out.
But this idea goes so much deeper than just a login screen. Think about it. Our jobs, our fields of study, our social circles, even the way we think about ourselves is structured into these clean, separate categories. We really do live in a world of boxes. And that brings up a huge question. What are we actually missing out on by staying inside them?
This isn't some new age problem. Some of the greatest minds in history saw this feeling of separation not as a fact, but as a kind of illusion. Albert Einstein, for instance, he called it an optical delusion of his consciousness, like a prison we build for ourselves that limits our compassion to just the few people closest to us. And it's not just Einstein. Martin Luther King Jr. said something incredibly similar, just from a different angle. He reminded us that we're all caught in this inescapable network of mutuality, that we're all tied in a single garment of destiny. Now, that's not just a nice philosophical thought. It's a description of how things actually are. So if we're so connected, why does our thinking so often keep us apart?
So, this whole problem of feeling separated has kicked off this really fascinating quest, the search for a tool, some kind of guide, to help us see the whole picture. Which brings us to our first section, a map for everything.
Okay, so what is this map? Well, it's called the Panorama of Understanding, a concept developed by a researcher named Heiner Benking. And the goal is incredibly ambitious, to create a map that doesn't just show what we know, but also very clearly shows what we don't know. It's a framework for bringing all these different perspectives together into one big, coherent view.
All right, so this panorama is built on three really simple pillars. First, there's the subject. That's you or me, the observer, the one doing the seeing. Then there's the object. That's the thing we're looking at, the focus of our attention. And finally, the context, the scenery, the environment where it all happens. Seems straightforward enough, right? A basic way to get our bearings.
But here's the twist.
The most radical, the most important part of this whole framework isn't the boxes themselves. It's actually the empty space. Yeah, what's missing from the map, that's where the magic is.
And this is where things get really innovative. Instead of just focusing on the things we know, this model forces us to pay attention to the unknown, to start charting those huge, crucial gaps in our understanding. See, in this way of thinking, those gaps aren't just empty voids. They're opportunities. They represent the questions we have to start asking to connect different ideas and to go beyond our own limited viewpoints. It makes the empty spaces in our knowledge just as valuable as the knowledge itself.
Right at the center of this whole thing is a concept called black box nature. Now, in engineering, a black box is a device where you can see the inputs and the outputs, but you have no idea what's happening on the inside. Here, it's a metaphor for the huge, beautiful complexity of nature that we can just never fully understand. It's there to keep us curious, but also to keep us humble.
And this is why this whole thing acts like a kind of universal translator for big ideas. It creates this common ground where concepts that seem totally unrelated, like Karl Popper's 3 worlds of reality and David Bohm's theories on matter and meaning, can finally talk to each other. It shows how all these different, complex worldviews can actually fit together and inform one another.
Okay, so what's the payoff here? Why should you care about any of this?
Well, it's all about developing a totally new kind of mental flexibility, a new way to see. So let's put these two ways of thinking side by side. Your typical hierarchical thinking is like a tree. It's rigid, everything is in its own silo, and it has a really hard time with complex dynamic systems. But panoramic thinking, that's more like a network. It's dynamic, it's holistic, and it's designed to uncouple those rigid connections in our minds so that new ideas can pop up.
The whole point of this is to develop something called mental locomotion. Just think of it like training your mind's eye to be more athletic. It's that ability to zoom out from a single argument and see how both sides are just part of a much larger conversation. It's about carrying an idea from science over to art and ultimately seeing that bigger picture we've been talking about. So really, what this whole framework is, it's an invitation. It's an invitation to think not just within our cozy little boxes, but to think between them, and even beyond them entirely. Beyond words, beyond established knowledge, beyond our typical categories, and yeah, even beyond our own cultures. But like with any map, there's a really important warning we have to keep in mind. The journey itself is the point, not the paper guide in your hand.
And it all comes down to that timeless piece of wisdom quoted in the source material. The map is not the territory. No matter how powerful a tool like the Panorama of Understanding might be, we have to remember it's just a model of reality. It's not reality itself.
And that's the absolute key takeaway here. The goal isn't to tear down our old boxes just so we can build a new, even bigger one. The real goal is to change how we think, to develop a more curious, a more flexible, and a more panoramic mindset that's always aware of that bigger picture and those vast unknown spaces. Which leaves us with one last really powerful question from the source material. In a world that's facing these incredibly complex, interconnected problems, can we really afford to keep building mental walls of segregation and reductionism? Can we afford to keep seeing the world in all these tiny, divided, competing parts?